Told the man who would become my son-in-law that I drove a delivery truck for a living. It wasn't the whole truth, but it turned out to be the smartest thing I ever said. Because 3 days after he moved into my house, I found out exactly why he'd rushed my daughter down the aisle. My name is not important. What matters is that I'm 64 years old, I live in a 2-story brick house on the edge of Decatur, Georgia, and I have spent the last 31 years building something most people never see coming from a man who grew up with nothing. I own a small fleet of commercial trucks, 7 of them, that haul freight up and down the I-20 corridor. I also own 3 rental properties in DeKalb County, one of which my daughter Cheryl had been living in rent-free since she graduated from Georgia State. I am not a flashy man. I drive a 2019 Ford F-150. I shop at Publix when there's a sale and Aldi when there isn't. I have not taken a vacation since my wife Dolores passed away from ovarian cancer 6 years ago. I wear the same Timberland boots I bought in 2021. There is nothing about my appearance that screams money, and that is entirely on purpose. Dolores used to tease me about it. She'd say, "Baby, you are the richest looking poor man I have ever seen." I took that as a compliment. When she died, she took something out of me that I have never fully gotten back. We were married 38 years. We built everything together. She kept the books for the trucking business out of a spiral notebook on the kitchen table before we could afford proper accounting software. She negotiated our first lease on a rental property while 8 months pregnant with Cheryl. She knew every number, every balance, every risk we ever took. After she was gone, I kept working because I didn't know what else to do with myself. Work was the only place grief couldn't follow me in. Cheryl is my only child. She's 32 now, sharp as a tack, looks exactly like her mother. She teaches 4th grade at an elementary school in Stone Mountain. She has Dolores's patience and her laugh and her habit of tilting her head to the left when she's listening to you. Every time I look at her, I feel 2 things at once: gratitude and an ache that doesn't have a name. She met a man named Terence at a church event in the spring. He was 41, divorced, no kids, said he worked in business development. When she introduced us, he had a firm handshake and a smile that worked just a little too hard. I noticed he scanned the room before he looked at me, not in a curious way, in an appraising way. "Your daughter talks about you constantly," he said. "Good things, I hope," I said. "Only good things. She says you've done really well for yourself." I remember feeling something shift in my chest when he said that. Not alarm exactly, more like the low hum of a smoke detector that hasn't gone off yet but is thinking about it. My old friend Howard, who I've known since we were both driving forklifts at a warehouse in Doraville back in 1989, met Terence at a cookout I threw in June. Afterward, Howard pulled me aside by the grill and said, "Ed, I'm not trying to get in your business." He always says that right before he gets in my business, but something about that man feels like he's doing math while everyone else is just talking. I told him he was being paranoid. I told myself the same thing. By July, Terence was at Cheryl's place, my rental property on Glenwood, most nights. By August, he had a drawer there. By September, they were engaged. Cheryl called me on a Tuesday evening, and I could hear the happiness in her voice, and it sounded so much like her mother's happiness that I pushed every hesitation I had deep down and said, "Baby, if he makes you happy, that's what matters." What I did not say, because I didn't want to dampen anything, was that Terence had asked me at that same June cookout what I did for work, and I had told him I drove a delivery truck. I said it the way I'd say anything true that isn't the complete picture. I do drive a truck sometimes. When a driver calls out sick, or I need to feel useful with my hands, I get behind the wheel myself. I just left out the part about owning 7 of them and the 3 houses. I don't know exactly why I did it. Partly habit. I've never been the type to volunteer financial information to people I don't know well. Partly something Howard said planting a seed I wouldn't admit had germinated. And partly, if I'm being honest, something in Terence's eyes the first time we shook hands. Something that was calculating the distance between where I was standing and what I was worth. The wedding was small. 50 people at a venue in Lithonia in October. Cheryl wore Dolores's pearl earrings and I cried in the parking lot for 5 minutes before I went in. The ceremony was genuinely beautiful. I gave my daughter away with a full heart and decided, standing at the altar beside her, that I was going to give this man a fair chance. Whatever I'd felt before, I was going to set it aside. 3 days later, Terence and I were sitting at my kitchen table. He had suggested we have a family meeting, which I thought meant the three of us, but Cheryl was at school. It was just the two of us, and Terence had a yellow legal pad in front of him with notes on it, and he was wearing the kind of calm expression that people wear when they've rehearsed something. He started slowly. He said he and Cheryl had been talking about their future. He said they wanted to start building towards stability. He said he had some ideas he wanted to run by me. I asked him what kind of ideas. He said he thought it made sense for them to move into my house, the Decatur house, my house. He said the Glenwood rental was fine, but it was a rental, and this was a real home, and since I was getting older and Cheryl was my only family, it only made sense for them to be close. I kept my face still. I've spent 30 years negotiating freight contracts. I know how to keep my face still. I asked him where he thought I would go. He said they'd been looking at a few senior living communities. There was a nice one in Covington, he said. Very well reviewed. Peaceful. Only about 40 minutes away. He said Cheryl would visit on weekends. I let a moment pass before I responded. I asked him if Cheryl had asked him to bring this to me. He said they'd talked about it together. He said it was a joint decision. That night, after he left, I called Cheryl. She answered on the second ring, cheerful, asking how the talk went. When I told her what Terence had proposed, there was a silence on the other end that told me everything I needed to know. He said we talked about it together, I said. Daddy, she said, and her voice had gone very small. I didn't know he was going to say that. I told her not to worry. I told her I was fine. After we hung up, I sat in Dolores's old chair in the living room, the one I've never been able to get rid of, and I did not feel fine. I felt the specific cold clarity that comes when something you hoped wasn't true turns out to be true. I called Howard. I'm not going to say I told you so, Howard said. Yes, you are. Yeah, he said. I am, but that comes later. What do you need right now? What I needed was information. Within the week, Howard, who knows everybody in every county in Metro Atlanta, I am convinced of this, found out that Terence had been married once before, briefly, to a woman in Gwinnett County who had owned a home outright. They had been married for 11 months. The divorce was not amicable. The woman's name was not in anything Howard could find, but the property dispute had been a matter of public record for a short time before settlement. I sat with that information for a few days. I didn't confront Cheryl with it immediately. I wanted to think clearly, and when I'm upset, I don't think clearly. Dolores used to say, I argued with my feelings instead of listening to them. She was right about most things. Terence came back to the house the following Saturday. Cheryl was with him this time. He was warm, charming, called me sir, the way men do when they want to appear respectful while being anything but. He brought sweet potato pie from a bakery in East Atlanta. We sat around the kitchen table, and it was almost normal, except that I could see him looking around the room in that same way, measuring. After a while, he brought up the senior living community again. Gently this time, as if it was simply a natural next step, he said he printed some information. He slid a brochure across the table toward me. I looked at it. It was a nice place. Landscaped grounds. A lot of older men and women smiling at chessboards. I asked him what he thought my house was worth. He seemed surprised by the directness of the question. He said he wasn't sure. Maybe $350, $375 in the current market. I said that was a reasonable estimate. Then I said I should probably mention something I hadn't gotten around to mentioning yet. I told him the house was not mine. He stared at me. I told him the house was an irrevocable living trust that Dolores and I had set up in 2009, administered jointly now by me and Cheryl's name as successor trustee. I told him the trust also held the 3 rental properties and was the primary vehicle through which the trucking business assets were managed. I told him that I, as an individual, meaning the man sitting across from him, owned very little of direct value. I told him this was not an accident. The sweet potato pie sat untouched between us. I told him that the night we met, when he asked what I did for work, I told him I drove a delivery truck. That was true. I just also own the company. And the houses, and I keep most of it in structures that aren't easy to reach. Terence looked at Cheryl. Cheryl was looking at the table. He asked carefully what I was trying to say. I said I wasn't trying to say anything. I was just making sure he had accurate information. Since he was family now, it seemed important that we all understood how things actually stood. He left about 20 minutes after that. The warmth had gone out of him like air from a tire. He was polite enough, not rude, nothing I could point to, but something had switched off behind his eyes, and I watched it happen in real time. Cheryl sat with me at the table after he pulled out of the driveway. For a while, neither of us said anything. Then she said, "Did you know from the beginning?" I said I didn't know anything. I suspected something. There's a difference. She asked me when I had set up the trust. I told her 2009. Long before Terence. Long before any of this. She nodded slowly, turning her coffee mug in her hands. She has her mother's hands. I noticed that again and felt the familiar ache. He's going to be angry, she said. I said that was his right. She said she didn't know about any of it. Not the trust, not the properties being in it, not the extent of things. She said she knew I did okay, but she hadn't known the whole picture. I told her I should have been more open with her about that. That was my fault and I was sorry for it. She looked up at me then, and there were tears in her eyes. But she wasn't crying. She said, "Daddy, he asked me, twice, before we got engaged, how much you were worth." I didn't say anything. She said, "I told him I didn't really know. I told him you were comfortable." She shook her head. I thought that was a weird question, but I told myself it was just him being practical. I put my hand over hers. I didn't say I told you so. I didn't say Howard told me so. I didn't say anything for a while. Just sat there with my daughter in the kitchen of the house that is technically held in trust on a Saturday afternoon in November, with a brochure for a senior living community still sitting on the table between us. Cheryl and Terence separated 4 months later. She didn't announce it dramatically. She called me on a Thursday evening and said it in the same steady, quiet voice she uses when she's made up her mind. She said there had been other things that had been building, and that the conversation at the kitchen table had been the moment she started looking at everything differently. I asked if she was okay. She said she was. She said she was better than okay, actually. She said she was staying at the Glenwood house for now, and she'd started going to a therapist her colleague had recommended, and that she'd signed up for a Saturday pottery class, which she had always wanted to do. I said that sounded exactly right. She said, "Daddy, can I ask you something?" I said, "Of course." She said, "Why did you tell him you drove a delivery truck?" I thought about it for a moment. Thought about Howard at the grill. Thought about Terence's eyes measuring the room. Thought about Dolores's spiral notebook on the kitchen table in 1993, and every decision we made together that led to a trust document and 3 rental properties and a fleet of 7 trucks. I said, because what a man does when he thinks you have nothing tells you everything you need to know about him. She was quiet for a second. Then she said, "I love you, Daddy." I said I loved her too. After we hung up, I sat in Dolores's chair for a long time. Outside, the November light was going low and orange over the neighborhood. I could hear the Hendersons' dog barking 2 doors down the way it always does at this hour. Everything was exactly as it had been. The house was quiet and it was mine. Or more precisely, it was ours. Dolores's and mine and Cheryl's, held in common across time in the way that careful people hold things when they understand that the world can take what you don't protect. I am not a man who regrets much. I have made mistakes in my life, and I have tried to make them right where I could, and I have accepted the ones I couldn't undo, but I do not regret that moment at the cookout in June, standing by the grill with a bottle of Heineken in my hand, telling a man I didn't trust that I drove a delivery truck. Dolores would have laughed at the whole thing. She would have shaken her head and said, "Baby, you are something else." And then she would have told me to call Howard and tell him he was right, because she believed in giving people their credit. So Howard, you were right. And to my daughter, who sat at that kitchen table and chose clarity over comfort, I have never been more proud of you than I was in that moment, and I was already pretty proud. Some people will tell you honesty is always the best policy. I believe that, mostly. But I also believe that what you choose not to say, and when you choose not to say it, and can be its own kind of wisdom. I kept a secret to protect what generations of work had built, and in doing so, I learned the truth about something I needed to know before it was too late. That has to be enough. Most days, it is more than enough. There's a thing I've noticed about people who come into your life wanting something. They almost always show you who they are before you're ready to see it. I saw it in Terence the first time we shook hands. That quick scan of the room. The smile that arrived a half-second too late. I told myself I was being an old man with too much suspicion and not enough grace. But the truth is I knew. I just wasn't willing to act on knowing until I had no other choice. What I did, keeping quiet about what I owned, letting a man believe I was something smaller than I was, wasn't dishonesty, it was patience dressed up as humility. There's a difference, and it matters. The lie wasn't in what I said, it was in what I waited to say, and when. That kind of restraint doesn't come easy. It took me most of my adult life to learn that not every truth needs to be spoken on your opponent's timeline. You choose when the cards go on the table. That's not deception. That's wisdom, and I don't apologize for it. Dolores used to say that how a person treats you when they think you have nothing is the only honest data point you're ever going to get about their character. She said it casually once, years ago, over dinner, and I half listened the way you do when someone says something true before you're old enough to need it. I needed it at 64. I needed it sitting across a kitchen table from a man with a yellow legal pad and a brochure for a place he wanted to send me to die quietly. That's when her words came back, and they came back with full force. The thing about Terence is that he wasn't unintelligent. He was organized. He had done his research, timed his moves, kept his real intentions tucked behind charm and patience of his own. What he didn't have, what no amount of planning can manufacture, was integrity. He built his approach on the assumption that I was a soft target, that a lonely widower in his 60s, grateful for any warmth, would hand over everything he'd spent a lifetime building just to keep the peace at the dinner table. He had no framework for a man who had already thought 10 moves ahead and was simply waiting. That's the part I want people to sit with, not the victory. I don't feel triumphant about any of it, because my daughter got hurt in the middle of it, and that's a cost I carry. What I want people to understand is that protecting what you've built is not selfishness. It is a form of moral clarity. It is knowing what something cost, in years, in sacrifice, in a woman who kept the books in a spiral notebook at the kitchen table, and refusing to let it be taken by someone who paid nothing for it and felt nothing for you. Cheryl showed something in that kitchen that I will never forget. She sat there and chose truth over comfort. That is not a small thing. That is the kind of resolve that gets built slowly through watching people you love make hard decisions with dignity and deciding you're going to do the same. I like to think Dolores is somewhere in that. I like to think some of what we modeled in this house went into our daughter's spine. I am 64 years old. I have made mistakes. I have misjudged people I should have mistrusted sooner and trusted people who disappointed me. But I did not get this far by being careless with what I know, what I own, or what I love. A man who stays awake to the world around him, who thinks before he speaks, who builds carefully and protects quietly, that man does not have to be loud about what he has. The work speaks, the structure holds, and when someone comes to take what isn't theirs, they find there's nothing there to take. That has to be enough. For me, most days it is.